回到全球聊天室，1997年7月1号，香港主权移交，到现在已经26年过去了。再往前推进个，如果将近200年的话呢？1842年，香港岛在南京条约当中被永久割让给英国，从此这个蛮荒小渔村变成了英国的殖民地。香港历来有28位港督，目前只有2位还在世。最后一位香港人称他为"肥彭"的末代香港总督彭定康，他的作风亲民，也受到香港人的爱戴。我们先来看一下他的小档案好了，英文名字呢叫做 Christopher Francis Patten。早年他出任过英国的环境大臣，还有保守党主席。1992年获委任成为末任香港总督。1997年，他见证了香港主权移交。2000年到2004年，他出任欧洲联盟外交事务专员。卸任之后呢，被册封为终身贵族，现任的牛津大学校监。去年香港主权移交正好满25周年，彭定康就出版了《香港日记》的英文版，记录他港督任内香港就他所观察到作为英国殖民地的运作方式，还有在主权移交前夕发生的各种大大小小事件。彭定康也在书中反思了香港的过去，还有现在，以及他跟北京当局打交道的心得。今年5月呢，这本《Hong Kong Diaries》就译成了中文版，在台湾面世。79岁的彭定康，他用视讯的方式出席了新书分享会。我们整理出来他接受现场提问的精彩内容，一起来看。
When we tried to develop democracy rather more rapidly, Chinese communist leaders, including Zhou Enlai, said we shouldn't do that because if we went too far down that road, people who lived in Hong Kong would think they were going to get independence as well, like Singapore or Malaysia. But that was never on the table. Hong Kong was a great international city, a great trading hub, a great example of how Asian cultures and Western cultures should combine to the benefit of everybody who lived in Hong Kong. Because I wanted to point to make one thing very clear. Some people used to say that Hong Kong was the goose that laid the golden egg for China. I never believed that was a reason why the Chinese Communist Party would leave it alone. And I never thought the goose and the golden egg were the right metaphor for China and Hong Kong. I always thought that Hong Kong was a sort of canary in the mine for the Chinese Communist Party. It would tell us a lot about them, and it would tell us whether free societies could actually manage if China became too powerful or China started bossing them all around. So I hope that's a lesson that people can draw from the book, which tells the truth as I and many others saw it, and is in some ways an elegy for what Hong Kong was and what Hong Kong could still be if it wasn't under a pretty brutal police state regime today. We made the existing electoral system for the legislature fairer than it had been, and without in any way changing the basic law or changing the joint declaration, because we try to keep our word, unlike the Chinese Communist Party. We made the system as democratic as possible and put in place elections which, when carried out in 1995, were wholly fair and provided a basis for going forward and making Hong Kong even more democratic. And one must not forget that at that period, the communist officials in the foreign ministry in Beijing and others closer to the ground in Hong Kong were promising that Hong Kongers would determine their own pace of democratization. And they promised that Hong Kong would be able to continue to grow and become an ever more democratic society. But as far as Hong Kongers who've gone in exile from a city which they love as a city which I loved, there are probably 140,000 or so who are in the UK over the last year or two. And of course, many others have gone to Australia and elsewhere. And they're already making a huge contribution. So we are hugely benefiting from the presence of so many talented Hong Kongers in the UK. But Hong Kongers who leave Hong Kong, unfortunately, means that Hong Kong is not as vibrant and lively as it has been. And it underlines a point which I think I may have made earlier, that what the Chinese Communist Party wants is Hong Kong without Hong Kongers. I think it's true to say that for 10 years, maybe a little more, after 1997, they by and large kept their distance and they by and large let Hong Kong get on with things. They nevertheless choked every attempt to make it more democratic. And when Xi Jinping came in, with leaders who were terrified that the party was losing its control, that its grip on every aspect of civil society was beginning to slip, I think at that point they decided they had to crack down on Hong Kong. You saw that in the subsequent elections for the district council, in which the pan-Democrats won by a landslide. And it was that which I think triggered the alarm in Beijing, that if things went on like that, sooner or later there would be a democratic majority, a substantial democratic majority in the Legislative Council. And that's when I think Xi Jinping and his acolytes decided they had to, in effect, run Hong Kong as a police state. I wrote recently to the Foreign Secretary to ask on what occasions the British government had made direct representations to the Chinese about Jimmy Lai's case. And I had a letter about the several instances in which they'd done that, but not with any success. We know why the Chinese Communist Party hates him. First of all, because he was a refugee from communism who was hugely successful in a free society. Secondly, because when they took over, he could have left before that or at any time with his money and lived somewhere else with a British passport. He could have, I'm sure, come to Taiwan or the United States, but he chose to stay because he's passionate about seeing Hong Kong survive as a free society. And what the communists hate above everything else is people who have the guts to stand up to them, is people who have the guts to stand up for what they believe in. The Chinese Communist Party tries to rewrite history. It says that Hong Kong was never a British colony. It was never run by Britain as part of its colonial empire. It says it was an occupied territory. Hong Kong was above all occupied by wave after wave of immigrants, of refugees from communism in China. And they had come because of the Great Famine, because of the Great Leap Forward, because of the Cultural Revolution. People like the now imprisoned Jimmy Lai, who'd stowed away on a ship. People clambered over razor wire. People swam through dangerous waters in order to get to, and this is such a moral embarrassment for the Chinese Communist Party, in order to escape communism and find a safe haven in a British colony. And that was a humiliation, I think, for the Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party promised, as part of their side of the bargain, that Hong Kong's way of life and a substantial degree of autonomy would be retained for 50 years after 1997. And this was called One Country, Two Systems by Deng Xiaoping. Now, it's a slogan which you will know very well in Taiwan, because it was originally, almost certainly, developed in order to cover Beijing's relationship with Taiwan. One country, two systems. And we were promised in the joint declaration, which was a treaty lodged at the UN, and in a basic law, which was a reflection of the joint declaration, we were promised that Hong Kong would continue to be the same open society it always was. Now, that begs the question of whether the Chinese Communist Party ever really understands what a free society is like, ever really understands the rule of law. When I first tried to explain the rule of law to my opposite number in Beijing back in 1992, he said, "We have the rule of law." I said, "No, you have ruled by laws. You make the laws and everybody has to follow what the executive says. The rule of law applies to the executive as well. It applies to everybody in the society." My general feeling was that China would lose a great deal of credit around the world if it went back on its word with Hong Kong, with the rule of law, with open society, with freedom of the press, and with democratization. That it would lose a huge deal of credit around the world. Taiwan is a democracy of 24 million people, which recalls that the slogan, "One country, two systems," was designed partially for Taiwan, maybe above all for Taiwan. And people in Taiwan can see what has happened to that promise in relation to Hong Kong. And that inevitably, I would guess, will have implications for people's attitudes to Taiwan. How couldn't it have? So I repeat that when I'm told by people who talk about Asian values, that democracy, the rule of law and the free media are inconsistent with the values of a Confucian society, I say, look at Taiwan. That's a Confucian society which is robustiously democratic, in which people have arguments, in which they have a free press, in which they can elect their government, in which they can throw out a president or a government they don't like. Does that happen in China? Will it ever happen in China? Maybe one day, probably not in my lifetime, but I do not for one moment believe that any dictatorship ends well. If anybody can give me an example of a dictatorship which ended well, I'd like to know what it is. So I'm optimistic about the values which represent Taiwan's contribution to the world.